Now, we've previously discussed the research led by British lawyer Trevor Asserson, which found that the BBC breached its own editorial guidelines for news coverage more than 1,500 times during the height of the Israel-Hamas war. Israel was associated with genocide 14 times more than Hamas, who carried out the mass terrorist attacks against Israelis on October 7. The BBC's Arabic channel was found to be one of the most biased of all global media outlets against Israel, with 11 instances in which their coverage featured reporters who publicly supported Hamas. Joining me now is senior partner at the Asserson Law Offices, Trevor Asserson. Trevor, is the BBC institutionally anti-Semitic? What is behind these breaches of editorial guidelines?
I think what's really behind these breaches, and they're systemic breaches, is a total management failure to control the journalists at the BBC. So I've not suggested that there's anti-Semitism. I've deliberately avoided doing that because it's not my concern to look at the motives behind individuals or the organisation. What I've looked at is systemic breaches of the BBC's own guidelines to be impartial. And the reason behind it really is that the BBC itself, although it has a deal with the British people, it will receive £4 billion a year, in return for which it promises to give impartial news. But they have absolutely no management controls at all in place to check whether or not they actually do it. That's, I think, the fundamental problem behind what's going on.
Well, these editorial guideline breaches by the BBC included all sorts of areas: accuracy, impartiality, editorial values, public interest. You mentioned that they're publicly funded. Our own publicly funded broadcaster, the ABC here in Australia, has a similar worldview to the BBC. In your experience, are taxpayer-funded broadcasters more likely to indulge in this sort of unrelentingly biased coverage against Israel?
I think that public sector broadcasters are as likely as any other news outlets to be captured by a particular viewpoint. The people within the senior management will tend to hire people who they think to be right-thinking, who think like them, and those people will tend to be hired and be promoted. It's very difficult for a public sector broadcaster to be impartial, or for any broadcaster to be impartial, unless it has very careful, proper management systems in place. The BBC absolutely doesn't. I've been approached by Australians concerned with the Australian public sector broadcaster, and I believe that there are serious problems there as well. I think what's really at stake is that some journalists who clearly have very, very negative views should not be just allowed they should be sent to something more harmless, like Gardner's Question Time, where they can do less harm. And they shouldn't be reporting on something where they are clearly using the platform to express their own personal views. And the guidelines say, we will not express our journalists' personal views. Well, that's a myth. It's been exploded by my report. And that it's that kind of breach. Another type of absolutely clear breach is that Hamas is a dictatorship that controls the reporting that comes out of Gaza Strip. And the BBC specifically states that whenever they're reporting from somewhere with reporting restrictions, they'll tell the audience. They never tell the audience that. They allow these people to report as though what they're telling is the truth, which it clearly isn't. And they know, the BBC knows it isn't the truth. They've got an obligation to say so. They fail.
Now, your report does illustrate that the lines between opinion and impartial, unbiased news reporting have been completely blurred. How is that fixed? Because this is an issue that goes beyond the BBC. You've got so many news reporters these days who think they are in the opinion game and they want to state their opinion. And there's, I think, a diminishing trust from the public in media because of that.
The response to my report, which I think may be the most in-depth analysis of any of the BBC's output that's ever been done, we looked at 9 million words. And it's worth saying that the BBC criticised the report for its methodology before they'd read it. The methodology is normal, standard litigation type analysis, which I've been doing my entire career. And in parallel with that, an entirely new cutting edge approach by data scientists led by a data scientist expert in the UK, but mainly Israelis from Israeli universities. And that supported the completely standard old style litigation approach. So the BBC, knee-jerk reaction attacking the report on methodology, what they're actually facing, instead of one methodology, they're facing two separate methodologies, dealing in real depth, as I said, searching for over 9 million words of product. And the net result is unremitting bias. Whether it can be resolved, I think, is a question for BBC management. They've got to control their journalists, and at the moment, they're just not getting a grip at all. They're just totally out of control.
Now, the BBC is hugely influential in world media. They have viewers, listeners across television, radio, social media, streaming. They've got global news outlets. They claim to be the most trusted news brand in the UK. You said they've disputed the methodology you've used in your report. Beyond that, have they had a response to your damning findings? Are they at least attempting to do better in the future?
Well, one of my proposals was that they should have a thematic review of their Middle East reporting. Now, 3 days after I sent them the report, they announced that they were conducting a thematic review of their Middle East reporting. So it's clearly bothered them that the report's arrived. And I think the report, they realise, has totally destroyed what trust there may have still have been in the minds of many people that the BBC is doing its job properly. The question is whether or not the BBC will actually read it with an open mind, and that remains to be seen. If not, I have a fear that this matter may have to appear before an English judge, and an English judge they understand what impartiality means, even if the BBC don't. And I think that they will find the BBC is in absolutely hopeless breach time and time again of its own rules.
Yes, and it's not just the BBC. I would argue our own ABC breaches its charter daily. It would be wonderful if you could run a review of their work. I know you said Australians have already been in contact with you requesting just that. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much.